Okay, so video number 2 in our really super basic series on biology is on DNA. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which we'll talk about in another lecture, the exact structure and how that whole comes together. But the thing that I didn't mention in our previous discussion about evolution is that there has to be something that is heritable. Something that can come from one generation and go to the next generation. Because if that's not the case, if we can't inherit something from our forebears, then our genes cannot change. Our expression, our behavior, our evolution cannot change generation to generation. And of course, the concept that we saw before with the bacteria was generation dependent, because the ones that died didn't pass on offspring, and the ones that did survive did pass on offspring. And so the first key aspect of DNA is that it is heritable. Now, the ways that we inherit our DNA kind of we'll go through in a genetics lecture and a sexual reproduction or non-sexual reproduction lecture, but the important aspect that we want to get in this lecture is that DNA is heritable and it gets passed from generation to generation, and the advantages and evolutionary phenotypes, so the expression of that DNA, they get passed from generation to generation. And the organisms in a given population that do the best are likely to reproduce the most, and they pass on the most of their DNA. And so, again, our example of the bacteria, the ones that survived in the antibiotic did the best, and so they passed on their DNA to the next generation. Okay, so genes, they seem fairly important, don't they? So what's a gene? It's a small, heritable section of the genome. Of genetic information. Now, as we'll come to see in a genetics lecture in second or third year, in like 6 months I'll get time to put out that course, the definition of a gene is a little bit complicated, and it's a little bit difficult to fully pin down exactly what a gene is based on whether it makes a protein, whether it's helpful, whether it's regulatory, whether it does multiple things, whether it's got a particular facilitator around it. But the important thing is a gene is a segment of the genome. It's a small section of genetic information, right? In the same way that we have computers, you might think of a genome as one if statement, or one small section of your code which does one little thing, a macro, if you want. Right? Now, what do genes do? Well, interestingly, in the human genome, 98% more than 98% of our genome doesn't code for proteins. So what does it do? Well, it's regulatory sequences, or it's diversity, or indeed, it codes for proteins. But you're confusing me, Ryan. What's all this protein? We'll get to that in the next lecture, don't worry. The important thing is that the cellular machinery, the things that make your cells work, are proteins, and proteins are programmed and created by your DNA. Now, basically that's the entirety of biology, which is what we're going to discuss over the next 6 months. But genes do a whole lot of stuff. Now, let's talk about the sequence. So the genome has only 4 nucleotides. A, T, G, and C, and they couple together in A to T and G to C, which I like to remember as at the Gold Coast, because I'm from Australia and we have the Gold Coast. So if you remember that you are at the Gold Coast, if you remember we're at the Gold Coast, you always remember that A goes to T and G goes to C. At the Gold Coast. Very simple. And that, with a couple little more tidbits, will be our entire DNA lecture. So, a little bit more to remember, a little bit more interesting stuff on DNA. So, obviously we have a genome. Well, you know, that's a basic fact that we need to know, is that we have a genome. And one might think that a genome gets larger for the larger the organism, or the more complex the organism. And that's not the case. Okay? So the number of genes that we have are roughly similar to an amoeba, which is a really small organism. It's not very complicated. So complexity equals not size of genome. Another thing I'd like to say is that there are other control apparatus for expression of proteins and the way that we develop other than DNA. If you took a fertilized egg and you put it on the shelf, it wouldn't grow into a person. It needs to grow in a very specific and controlled environment with specific signals. And it has other things like epigenetic control. The point is, DNA on its own in a cell is not enough to make an organism. And I want to impress that upon us, that DNA we can think of as a computer code, but that computer code needs to run. Or indeed that if we call the DNA a blueprint, maybe it's a blueprint with a bit of kind of inaccessibility to particular regions, and it's a bit complicated, and it's not that straightforward. Think of twins, identical twins, who aren't actually super identical, you can tell them apart, and that's a decent example of what I mean. Okay, and that is our very quick little introduction to DNA. I'll see you in the next video.